The emergency video call from Burkina Faso came at 3 a.m. Paris time. PharmaCorp's CEO Dr. Laurent Dubois was awakened by frantic assistants saying the African president demanded an immediate explanation for medical irregularities. Dubois assumed it was about delayed vaccine shipments. What he found instead was Ibrahim Traoré holding autopsy reports of children who had died from his company's experimental drugs. The nightmare was about to begin. But to understand how this pharmaceutical giant's empire crumbled in a single video call, we need to go back to what happened 48 hours earlier in a small hospital ward in Ouagadougou, a discovery so horrifying it would shake the global medical industry to its core. Dr. Aminata Kabore, head of pediatrics at Charles de Gaulle Hospital, had been noticing a disturbing pattern. In the past 3 months, 12 children between the ages of 4 and 12 had died from sudden organ failure after receiving what PharmaCorp claimed were enhanced malaria vaccines, distributed through their humanitarian program. The deaths shared identical symptoms: severe liver damage, kidney failure, and neurological deterioration, none consistent with malaria or any known tropical disease. But what made Dr. Kabore's blood run cold was that all 12 children came from families who had participated in PharmaCorp's Free Childhood Protection Initiative. When she tried to contact PharmaCorp's local representatives for the vaccine composition details, she was told the information was proprietary and protected by international patent law. When she persisted, threatening to involve health authorities, the company's lawyers informed her that questioning their humanitarian efforts could result in legal action for defamation. That's when Dr. Kabore made a decision that would change everything. She contacted President Traore directly. What she told him would launch the most explosive pharmaceutical investigation in African history. "Mr. President," she said during their emergency meeting, "these aren't malaria vaccines. The tissue samples show compounds I've never seen before. These children were being used as test subjects for experimental drugs." President Traore stared at the medical files spread across his desk. Each folder contained the last days of a child whose only crime was being born poor in Africa. "You're telling me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that a French pharmaceutical company has been conducting illegal drug trials on our children?" Dr. Kabore nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The autopsies reveal multiple experimental compounds in their bloodstreams, compounds that don't exist in any approved malaria vaccine. But what neither of them knew yet was that PharmaCorp's operations in Burkina Faso were just the tip of an iceberg that stretched across 12 African countries, involving thousands of children used as unwilling test subjects for drugs worth billions on the international market. That revelation would come when Traoré's intelligence team uncovered something even more sinister. At 2:47 a.m. Paris time, Dr. Laurent Dubois was jolted awake by his phone buzzing urgently. His assistant's panicked voice cut through his sleep. "Sir, we have an emergency. The president of Burkina Faso is demanding an immediate video conference about medical irregularities." Dubois, still groggy, assumed this was routine bureaucratic nonsense. African leaders often complained about delayed shipments or demanded more aid money. This would be a quick call to smooth things over. "Set it up," he mumbled, already mentally preparing his usual script about PharmaCorp's commitment to African health initiatives, how catastrophically wrong he was. By 3:15 a.m. Dubois was in his home office, impeccably dressed despite the hour, flanked by his chief legal counsel and head of African operations. The video connection established, revealing President Traoré in his office. But something was immediately different about this call. Traoré wasn't alone. Beside him sat Dr. Kabore, and behind them stood what appeared to be several other medical professionals and government officials. This wasn't a routine diplomatic call, this was a tribunal. "Dr. Dubois," Traoré began, his voice carrying an edge that made the pharmaceutical executive instinctively uncomfortable. "Thank you for taking this urgent call. We need to discuss your company's humanitarian work in Burkina Faso." "Of course, President Traoré," Dubois replied with practiced corporate charm. "PharmaCorp is always committed to supporting healthcare initiatives across Africa. If there's been some administrative delay, 12 children are dead, Dr. Dubois. The words hit the video call like a sledgehammer. Dubois blinked, his rehearsed responses suddenly inadequate. I'm sorry to hear about any health challenges in your country, but I'm not sure how PharmaCorp. Traore lifted a thick folder from his desk. These are autopsy reports, Dr. Dubois. 12 children, ages 4 to 12, all died within 72 hours of receiving your enhanced malaria vaccines. Dubois felt his throat constrict. President Traore, if children have unfortunately succumbed to malaria despite vaccination, that's a tragedy. But vaccines aren't 100% effective. They didn't die from malaria, Dr. Dubois. The temperature in both rooms seemed to drop 10 degrees. They died from organ failure caused by experimental compounds that don't exist in any approved malaria vaccine. Dubois glanced frantically at his legal counsel, who was rapidly taking notes and looking increasingly pale. I think there may be some misunderstanding, Dubois said carefully. PharmaCorp only distributes WHO-approved vaccines through our humanitarian programs. That's when Traore did something that made Dubois's blood freeze. He pulled out a second document, one that made the CEO's face go completely white. This is interesting, Dr. Dubois, because I have here a copy of your internal memo to PharmaCorp's board of directors dated 3 months ago. Dubois stared at the screen in horror. That memo wasn't supposed to exist outside the most secure company servers. Should I read it aloud, Dr. Dubois? Or would you prefer to explain to me what Phase 3 trials using sub-Saharan subject pool for compound XN47 means? The silence stretched like a taut wire. Dubois' legal counsel was frantically whispering in his ear, but the CEO couldn't hear anything over the thundering of his own heartbeat. That document is confidential corporate property, Dubois finally managed. I don't know how you obtained it, but are you denying its authenticity? Traore's voice cut through his stammering. The trap was perfect. Deny it and face evidence proving he was lying. Confirm it, and admit to conducting illegal medical experiments on African children. Dr. Dubois, Traore continued, let me help you understand the gravity of this situation. We have autopsy reports showing that your malaria vaccines contained experimental neural inhibitors, liver toxins, and compounds designed to suppress immune responses. Dubois felt the room spinning. That's impossible. All our humanitarian vaccines are standard WHO formulations. Then perhaps you can explain this. Traore held up a vial of clear liquid. This is what was actually in your vaccine doses. Our laboratory analysis shows it contains 3 experimental compounds currently in Phase 2 trials for treating multiple sclerosis in European patients. The implications crashed over Dubois like a tsunami. His company had been using African children as test subjects for drugs intended for Western markets. You were testing multiple sclerosis drugs on healthy African children by disguising them as malaria vaccines. Traore continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Dubois' legal counsel grabbed his arm, whispering urgently about saying nothing more, but Dubois was beyond rational thought. The compounds were safe, he blurted out, immediately realizing his mistake. They were just enhanced formulations. Enhanced with experimental neural toxins? The words hung in the air like poison gas. Dubois had just admitted that PharmaCorp's vaccines were indeed enhanced with experimental compounds. 12 children, Dr. Dubois. 12 African children used as test subjects for your European drug trials, and they died because of your enhancements. But Traore wasn't finished. He pulled out another document that made Dubois go from pale to completely ashen. This is even more interesting. Your company's projected profits from successful trials of compound XN47, $12 billion annually. Cost per test subject in European trials, $50,000. Cost per test subject in African trials, $15. The stark arithmetic of exploitation was laid bare. European patients were paid $50,000 to participate in trials, while African children were unknowingly used for $15 worth of fake vaccines. You turned our children into laboratory rats, Dr. Dubois, and when they started dying, you covered it up. Dubois was now visibly sweating, his corporate composure completely shattered. President Traore, you have to understand, medical research requires test populations and, did you just say our children are test populations? The words exploded across the video call. Even Dubois' own legal team looked horrified at what their CEO had just admitted. I didn't mean, what I meant was, but the damage was done. On camera, with witnesses present, the CEO of one of Europe's largest pharmaceutical companies had just referred to African children as test populations. Dr. Dubois, Traore said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you because this will be the last conversation PharmaCorp ever has with any African government. The threat was unmistakable. Dubois was about to lose access to an entire continent. Effective immediately, Burkina Faso is expelling all PharmaCorp personnel from our territory. We are seizing all company assets pending criminal investigation. We are sharing all evidence with the International Criminal Court. Dubois shot up from his chair, panic overtaking him completely. You can't do this. We have diplomatic immunity. We have contracts. Contracts don't cover mass murder, Dr. Dubois. The words hit like a physical blow. Murder. That's what this was being called now. Furthermore, Traore continued relentlessly, I am announcing the formation of the African Medical Sovereignty Alliance. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa have already agreed to join. We will be conducting joint investigations into all Western pharmaceutical operations on our continent. The implications were staggering. PharmaCorp wasn't just losing Burkina Faso, they were about to lose their entire African testing ground. But Traore had saved the most devastating revelation for last. Oh, and Dr. Dubois, you might be wondering how we obtained your internal memos. Dubois stared at the screen, his face a mask of confusion and terror. Meet Dr. Sarah Mitchell, your former head of African operations. A woman stepped into view, beside Traore, someone Dubois recognized with growing horror. Dr. Mitchell had been privy to every aspect of PharmaCorp's African operations. Dr. Mitchell came to us 3 weeks ago with a complete archive of your company's activities across Africa. Every memo, every trial result, every cover-up. Dubois felt his world collapsing. Mitchell had been his most trusted lieutenant in African operations. If she had turned whistleblower, she would have access to everything. Sarah, Dubois whispered. How could you? Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, her face a mask of controlled rage. How could I? Laurent, I watched 12 children die, knowing we could have saved them. I watched you order their deaths covered up to protect stock prices. The question isn't how could I, it's how could you? We were helping Africa, Dubois said desperately. We were providing free medical care. You were using African children as disposable test subjects, Mitchell shot back. And when they started dying, you told me to destroy the evidence. This new revelation sent shockwaves through both rooms. Not only had PharmaCorp conducted illegal trials, they had actively covered up the deaths. Dr. Mitchell has provided us with over 10,000 documents, Traore continued, covering operations in 12 African countries, involving over 15,000 children used as unknowing test subjects. The scope of the scandal was breathtaking. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systematic exploitation of an entire continent. Dubois collapsed back into his chair, the fight going out of him completely. What do you want? Justice, Traore replied simply. Full disclosure of all compounds used in African trials. Complete medical records for all test subjects, and $500 million in compensation for the families affected. $500 million, Dubois' voice cracked. That would bankrupt the company. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before turning our children into laboratory experiments. The call was clearly nearing its end, but Traore had one final bombshell to deliver. Dr. Dubois, there's something else you should know. This entire conversation has been broadcast live to the African Union headquarters. 47 African health ministers have been watching your admissions. Dubois stared at the screen in absolute horror. Everything he had said, every admission, every incriminating statement had been witnessed by the health leadership of an entire continent. You've just confessed to medical experimentation on African children in front of 47 Health ministers, Traore continued. I believe that makes this the most expensive pharmaceutical scandal in history. This isn't over, Dubois said weakly, but his threat carried no weight. Oh, but it is, Traore replied. PharmaCorp's African operations are finished. Dr. Mitchell will be testifying before the International Criminal Court next week, and I suspect European authorities will be very interested in a company that conducts illegal medical experiments on children. The screen went black, leaving Dubois staring at his own reflection, the face of a man whose empire had just crumbled in real time. Within hours, the recorded call had leaked to international media. The footage of Dubois admitting that African children were test populations played on news channels worldwide, sparking global outrage. The European Medicines Agency launched an immediate investigation. Stock markets reacted violently, with PharmaCorp shares plummeting 78% in a single day. Criminal charges were filed in France, Switzerland, and Belgium. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the formation of the African Medical Sovereignty Alliance. Within a week, 32 African nations had joined, effectively ending Western pharmaceutical companies' ability to conduct unregulated trials on the continent. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's testimony before the International Criminal Court revealed the full scope of PharmaCorp's operations. Over 50,000 African children had been used as unknowing test subjects over 5 years, with at least 200 confirmed deaths directly linked to experimental compounds. 6 months later, Dr. Laurent Dubois was arrested at Charles de Gaulle Airport, attempting to flee to a non-extradition country. PharmaCorp filed for bankruptcy, with its assets seized to compensate affected families. In Burkina Faso, President Traore established the African Center for Medical Ethics, with Dr. Cabaret as its first director. Their mission, ensuring that no African child would ever again be used as an unknowing test subject for foreign pharmaceutical experiments. The 12 children who had died were not forgotten. A memorial in Ouagadougou bears their names with an inscription in French and Maure. They died as test subjects. They are remembered as children. At the memorial's dedication, Traore spoke to the gathered families. Your children's sacrifice exposed a system that treated African lives as expendable. Today, we ensure that never happens again. The pharmaceutical industry had learned a hard lesson. The age of exploiting African children for European profits was over. And it had ended with a young president who refused to let corporate criminals hide behind humanitarian pretenses. The 3 a.m. phone call that Dr. Dubois thought would be routine had become the moment that changed medical ethics in Africa forever. Sometimes justice comes not from courts or laws, but from leaders with the courage to say, not our children, not anymore.